Did you know that in the Middle Ages, the average person would encounter more dead bodies in a single month than a modern soldier sees in a lifetime? It wasn't because of a singular war, nor a specific battle. It was simply the cost of breathing. In a world where a toothache could be a death sentence and a glass of water could burn your insides with fever, death wasn't a tragedy, it was a neighbor who never knocked before entering. Welcome to the 14th century. To understand the story we are about to tell, you must first forget everything you know about safety, about rights, and about the future. In this world, the future is a luxury only the mad dare to dream of. The sun rises over a sprawling, walled city, perhaps Paris, perhaps London, or maybe a crowded fiefdom in the Holy Roman Empire. The location matters less than the smell. Before you open your eyes, the stench hits you. A thick, cloying cocktail of unwashed bodies, rotting timber, animal waste, and the metallic tang of old blood. There is no escaping it. It clings to the heavy wool tunics of the peasantry and settles into the velvet folds of the nobility. Down in the mud-choked streets, the day begins not with the chirping of birds, but with the tolling of the iron bell. Dong, dong. It is the sound of the parish church announcing the morning mass, but to the locals, it is also a head count. Who survived the night? We follow a pair of muddy boots trudging through the slush. This is Thomas, a tanner. His hands are stained permanently dark from the urine and acidic barks used to cure leather. He is 30 years old, which makes him a seasoned elder in his district. He steps over a bundle of rags in the alleyway. He doesn't look down. He knows that the bundle was a man yesterday, a beggar who coughed up pink froth until his heart gave out in the cold. By noon, the body collectors will toss him onto a cart like a sack of spoiled grain. There is no police tape, no investigation, no mourning. He is just debris in the gutter of history. Thomas keeps walking. He has to. In this world, if you stop moving, you starve. Above him, looming like stone giants, are the castles and cathedrals. This is where the true horror of the age lies, not in the bacteria, but in the hierarchy. The world is divided into 3 strict orders: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Thomas works. The baron in the castle fights. The bishop in the cathedral prays. And the gap between them is not measured in money, but in the value of a human soul. Let us shift our gaze to the town square. It is market day, but the main attraction isn't the turnips or the salted fish. A crowd is gathering around a wooden platform. The atmosphere is electric, buzzing with a grim excitement that modern minds might find repulsive. Mothers hold their children up on their shoulders. Men pass wineskins back and forth. They are here for the show. On the platform stands a man accused of poaching, stealing a deer from the Lord's forest to feed a starving family. In our world, this is a misdemeanor. Here, it is a theft from God's appointed ruler. The executioner steps forward. He is a massive figure, his face obscured not by a hood, but by the indifference of a man just doing a job. He holds a heavy iron bar. The crowd goes silent. They want to hear the crack. This is the abuse of power in its most absolute form. The law is not written to protect the people. It is written to protect the property of the powerful. The punishment is designed to be visceral, a theater of pain. When the iron bar comes down, shattering the poacher's arm, the crowd does not gasp in horror. They cheer. Why? Are they monsters? No. They are desensitized. When you watch your own children die of flux, When you see your wife wither away from a simple infection, the suffering of a stranger becomes entertainment. It is a distraction from their own inevitable demise. It is a way of saying, "Look, death has taken him, but not me, not today." High above, watching from a balcony draped in crimson tapestries, stands the lord of the manor. He holds a goblet of wine, his fingers adorned with rings that cost more than the lifetime earnings of everyone in the square below. He looks bored. To him, the man screaming on the wheel is not a human being. He is livestock that stepped out of line. This lord holds the power of high and low justice. He can decide who marries, who moves, and who dies. If he takes a fancy to a peasant's daughter, the peasant steps aside or faces the dungeon. If he needs more grain for his war horses, the village starves. There is no appeal. There is no supreme court.
There is only the Lord, and above him, a God who seems increasingly angry. As the sun sets, casting long, jagged shadows across the city, the gates are barred. The fear changes shape. During the day, the fear is of the whip, the tax collector, and the hunger. At night, the fear is of the unseen. The medieval mind is besieged by demons. They are in the wind, in the shadows, in the scratching of rats behind the walls. And the greatest demon of all is the plague. It hasn't arrived in full force yet in our story, but the precursors are there. The bad air, the sudden fevers. In a small, drafty hut, Thomas the tanner sits by a dying fire. He looks at his hands. They are shaking. He feels a heat rising in his neck, a swelling under his arm. He knows what it might be. He looks at his sleeping children, huddled together for warmth on a straw mat. The omnipresent specter of death has entered the room. The church teaches that life is merely a painful waiting room for the afterlife, a test of endurance. But as Thomas touches the tender lump on his neck, he realizes the game is rigged. The baron in the castle has thick walls and roaring fires to keep the sickness at bay, at least for a while. The bishop has prayers and incense. Thomas has nothing but the mud. This is the stage for our story. A world where life hangs by a thread, snapped easily by the whim of a king or the bite of a flea. A world where mercy is a myth and cruelty is the currency of power. But even in the darkest soil, seeds of rebellion can grow. As the fire dies down and the cold creeps in, Thomas doesn't pray for salvation. He feels a spark of anger. It is a small, dangerous thing, hot and bright. The bells toll again in the distance. Dong, dong. Another soul has departed. The dance of death continues, spinning round and round, dragging popes and paupers alike into the abyss. But for those left behind, the music is starting to change. The silence of the oppressed is about to break. And it will begin with a whisper that will turn into a scream. Did you know that in the 14th century, a starving human being was legally considered less valuable than a wild animal? Under the draconian forest law of England, the forests were not nature's bounty open to all. They were the exclusive playgrounds of the king and his favored nobility. To cut a branch was a fine. To kill a deer was an act of treason against the king's property, a crime often punished with mutilation or death. It didn't matter if your children were eating boiled grass to survive. The king's venison was sacred, and your life was cheap. This wasn't just a grim piece of trivia for the history books. For Thomas the tanner, standing in the churning mud of the village square, it was the terrifying reality of a Tuesday morning.
The village of Oakhaven was usually defined by the rhythmic scraping of hides and the lowing of cattle, But today, the air was thick with a suffocating silence. The entire populace had been summoned. They stood in a ragged semicircle, their breath misting in the cold, damp air, eyes fixed on the center of the green. There, kneeling in the muck, was Elias. Elias was a man Thomas had known since childhood. He was a cooper, a maker of barrels, with hands scarred from oak splinters and a back bent from labor. He was also a father of 4. The winter had been harsh. The harvest rot had taken the wheat, and the plague rumors had stopped the trade wagons. Elias's youngest, a girl of 5, had stopped crying from hunger 3 days ago. She had simply gone silent, her eyes growing too large for her skull. So, Elias had gone into the gray mist woods. He hadn't taken a stag, he wasn't a fool. He had snared a small doe, a scrawny thing that would have barely provided a week's stew.
He hadn't even made it back to his hut. "Look at him," a voice sneered from above. Lord Geoffrey de Vray sat atop a white destrier, a horse that was better fed and groomed than any human standing in the mud. The Lord was a man of soft edges and hard eyes, wrapped in a cloak of velvet so blue it hurt the eyes to look at amidst the gray squalor of the village. He held a pomander, a ball of aromatic herbs, to his nose, shielding his delicate senses from the stench of the unwashed masses. "He steals from me," Lord Geoffrey announced, his voice bored, as if he were discussing a ledger error rather than a man's life. "He steals from the crown. And for what?" The bailiff, a brutish man with a face like a clenched fist, kicked a bundle wrapped in bloody sacking. It rolled open, revealing the carcass of the doe. "Hunger, my lord," Elias croaked. His face was a mask of bruises, one eye swollen shut where the bailiff's men had introduced him to the concept of justice. "My little girl, she is fading." Lord Geoffrey sighed, a sound of immense irritation. He adjusted his gloves. "And if I allowed every peasant with a sob story to loot my forests, I would have no forests left by Michaelmas. You imagine your hunger makes you special, Cooper. It does not. It merely makes you a parasite." Thomas watched from the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the phantom heat of the swelling on his own neck, that secret sentence of death he had discovered only hours ago. He looked at Elias, then at the Lord. The disparity was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. Elias had created barrels that stored the Lord's wine. He had worked until his fingers bled, and now he was being discarded because he dared to try to sustain the life he had been cursed with. "The law is clear," the Lord said, waving a hand dismissively. "Hang him and leave the body. Let the crows have the meat he tried to steal." A wail ripped through the crowd, Elias's wife. She tried to surge forward, but 2 neighbors held her back, their own faces pale with terror. To intervene was to join him. The brutality of what happened next lay not in the gore, but in the efficiency. There was no ceremony. There was no priest offering last rites. The bailiff simply threw a rough hemp rope over the sturdy branch of the old oak that marked the village center. A noose was cinched around Elias's neck. Elias didn't scream. He looked into the crowd, locking eyes with Thomas for a fleeting second. In that look, Thomas didn't see fear. He saw exhaustion. He saw a man who was tired of apologizing for his own existence. "Up," the bailiff grunted. 3 guards hauled on the other end of the rope. Elias was jerked from his knees. His feet kicked frantically at the empty air, seeking purchase that wasn't there. The sound was wet and heavy. The creak of the branch, the strain of the rope, and the choking, guttural gasps of a dying man. The Lord did not watch. He was busy inspecting a loose thread on his riding glove.
This was the true horror of the feudal world. It wasn't that the Lord enjoyed the cruelty, it was that he was indifferent to it. To Lord Geoffrey, Elias was not a man with a history, a family, and a soul. He was a broken tool, a nuisance, a pest that had been dealt with. The execution was arbitrary, a whim exercised before breakfast, requiring no more emotional investment than swatting a fly. Elias's struggles slowed. The frantic kicking turned into a twitch. His face, dark and congested, stared blindly at the gray sky. The silence in the village was absolute, save for the weeping of the widow, which had devolved into a low, broken keening. "Let this be a lesson," the Lord said, finally looking up as the body settled into a gruesome stillness. "The king's law is absolute. Order must be maintained."
He turned his horse, the beast's hooves splashing mud onto the closest peasants, and rode back toward the stone keep on the hill, followed by his retinue. They chatted as they rode, laughter drifting back on the wind. They were likely discussing the evening's feast, where they would dine on roast venison, carved from the very same herd Elias had died for touching. The crowd began to disperse, heads bowed, eyes on the ground. To look up was to invite notice. To be noticed was to be in danger. But Thomas did not look down. He stood rooted to the spot, staring at the swaying body of his friend. The anger that had sparked in him earlier when he found the plague boil now roared into a furnace. He touched the tender lump on his neck, hidden beneath his collar. "They kill us for hunger," Thomas thought, the realization cold and sharp as a dagger. "They kill us for sport. They kill us because they can." He looked at the retreating back of the Lord. Lord Geoffrey rode with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable, protected by stone walls and divine right. But Thomas carried a weapon within his own blood now. The sickness coursing through him respected no titles. It knew no forest law. Elias was dead because he broke a rule of man, but the rule of nature was coming for them all. Thomas turned away from the hanging tree, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He walked past the sobbing widow, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder, not in comfort, but in a silent vow. The fear that usually governed his life had evaporated, burned away by the fever beginning to rise in his blood. The Lord had shown them death today to instill fear. But as Thomas walked back to his tannery, the scent of death already clinging to his own skin, he realized the Lord had made a fatal miscalculation. You cannot threaten a man who is already dead, and you certainly should not anger him.
Did you know that in the Middle Ages the word mercy didn't always imply forgiveness or kindness? Sometimes mercy was a piece of steel. Specifically, it was a long, thin dagger known as a misericorde. Its blade was not designed for slashing or parrying. It was crafted for one singular gruesome purpose: to slip through the eye slits of a helmet or the gaps in plate armor, to pierce the brain or heart of a knight who was too broken to be ransomed. On the fields of France, receiving the misericorde was often the only luck a dying man could hope for. The air did not smell of glory. It did not smell of honor or king or country. The air smelled of copper and emptied bowels. Thomas stood ankle-deep in a slurry of mud and blood that sucked at his boots with every shifting step. The skirmish had ended only an hour ago, yet the silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the charge. He gripped his spear, the wood slick with sweat and grime, his knuckles white.
The loops of his own anatomy spilled through his fingers, steaming in the cold air. He was weeping, a low, rhythmic sound that was more animal than human. "Mother," the boy gurgled, pink froth bubbling at his lips. "Mother, it's cold." Thomas felt the sickness rise in his throat, bitter and acidic. There was no surgeon coming. There were no bandages for men like them. In the stories the bards sang in the taverns, knights died with poetic last words, slumping gracefully from their steeds. In reality, men died screaming as they drowned in their own fluids, frantically trying to push their insides back into their bodies. A shadow fell over the dying boy. Thomas looked up to see the imposing silhouette of a man in partial plate armor, a tabard emblazoned with the Devray crest, stained dark with mud. It was not Lord Geoffrey himself, but one of his men-at-arms, a brute named Caelan, who served as an enforcer of the levy. Caelan looked down at the boy with the dispassion of a butcher eyeing a side of beef that had spoiled. He didn't offer water, he didn't offer a prayer. "He's done," Caelan grunted, his voice muffled by his visor. Waste of a cart ride. The man-at-arms drew a dagger from his belt. It was a thin, needle-point blade, the Misericorde. Thomas watched, frozen by a mixture of horror and the terrifying realization of his own powerlessness. The boy looked up at Caelan, his eyes widening, not with fear, but with a desperate pleading. He knew pain, and he wanted it to stop. Caelan stepped forward, placed a heavy boot on the boy's chest to pin him, and drove the dagger downward into the gap between the neck and the collarbone. The boy convulsed once, a violent shudder that rattled his teeth, and then he went limp. The weeping stopped. The only sound left was the sucking noise of Caelan pulling the blade free. "Clean your spear, Tanner," Caelan barked at Thomas, wiping his blade on the dead boy's tunic. "We march in the hour. The Lord wants to reach the encampment before dusk." Thomas didn't move immediately. He stared at the corpse. This was the noble war. This was the system that Elias had died for. Elias had been hanged for a deer. This boy had been gutted for a line on a map he couldn't read. Across the field, the scene was repeating itself. The victors moved among the fallen, not to offer aid, but to loot and to finish the work. The clink, clink, clink of daggers prying out gold teeth or cutting purse strings drifted on the wind. It was a harvest. They were gleaning the fields of the dead. Thomas looked toward the ridge where the knights were gathered. There sat Lord Geoffrey Devray, mounted on a destrier that cost more than Thomas's entire village would earn in a lifetime. Geoffrey's armor was dented but intact. He was laughing, accepting a wineskin from a squire, pointing at something in the distance. He looked untouched by the gore that coated the men on the ground. To him, the red slush Thomas stood in was just numbers on a ledger. A sharp throb pulsed in Thomas's neck. He reached up, his rough fingers brushing the collar of his tunic. Beneath the fabric, the swelling was hard and hot, the size of a pigeon's egg now, the plague boil. It didn't hurt as much as it had days ago. Now it felt like a second heart, beating with a dark, feverish rhythm. He watched Lord Geoffrey wipe wine from his lips. The Lord thought his armor made him invincible. He thought his high walls and his sharp swords kept him safe from the filth of the peasantry. He believed that death was something he dealt out to others, to poachers like Elias, to peasant levies like the boy with the gutted belly. Thomas tightened his grip on his spear until the wood groaned. He felt the fever burning behind his eyes, a fire that made the gray world seem sharp and bright. "You have your steel," Thomas thought, staring at the distant lord. "You have your mercy daggers and your executioners." Thomas took a breath, inhaling the stench of the dead, letting it fill his lungs. He didn't feel fear anymore. He felt like a vessel. "I carry a weapon you cannot parry, my lord. I carry a judgment that cares nothing for your armor." He stepped over the body of the boy, his boots squelching in the mire. He fell into line as the orders were shouted, marching toward the man who had ruined his life. Thomas was a walking corpse, a dead man breathing, and he would not rest until he had shared his sickness with the man who thought himself a god. The war for the crown was happening all around them, but Thomas's war was silent, invisible, and already coursing through his veins.
Did you know that the long drop, the calculated method of hanging designed to break a prisoner's neck instantly, was not a concept known to the executioners of our time? In this era, the crown did not seek efficiency, it sought a spectacle. When a man was swung from the gibbet, he did not simply die, he danced. He suffocated, kicking and thrashing in a desperate, airless ballet that could last for 20 agonizing minutes. And the crowd? They did not look away in horror. They brought their children, they ate roasted nuts, and they loved nothing more than a long performance. The mud of the battlefield was still caking Thomas's boots, heavy and slick with blood, but his mind had drifted. The fever was a hot iron pressed against the base of his skull, blurring the line between the road beneath his feet and the memories etched into his soul. As he marched toward the encampment of Lord Geoffrey, the rhythm of his own ragged breathing transformed into the rhythmic beating of a drum, the drum of the town square. Thomas was no longer walking through the aftermath of war. In his delirium, he was back in the marketplace of his hometown 3 years prior. It was a Tuesday, market day, but the stalls selling turnips and rough-spun wool were empty. The commerce of coin had been suspended for the commerce of flesh. The square was a theater constructed of cobblestone and timber. At its heart stood the gallows, a permanent fixture of rot-resistant oak that cast a long, thin shadow over the common folk. It was the stage upon which the king's justice was performed, a play with only one ending. Thomas remembered the smell. It wasn't the metallic scent of fresh slaughter that currently filled his nose, but the smell of unwashed bodies pressed tight together, mingling with the aroma of meat pies being sold by opportunistic hawkers. The execution was not a solemn occasion, it was a festival. He saw the crowd through the haze of his memory. They were a surging sea of brown tunics and stained coifs, jostling for a better view. Fathers lifted their young sons onto their shoulders, pointing toward the raised platform as if to say, "Look closely, boy, this is what happens when you steal." On the platform, the executioner stood like a statue carved from granite. He wore a hood of black sackcloth, not to hide his identity, everyone knew it was the blacksmith's brother, but to dehumanize him, to turn him into an instrument of the law, rather than a man who drank ale at the tavern. And then there was the condemned. Thomas's fevered mind focused on the man. It was old Silas, a weaver whose hands had been crippled by arthritis, rendering him unable to work. His crime was not murder nor treason. Silas had stolen a wheel of cheese from the Merchants' Guild. For that, the law demanded his life. Silas stood on the ladder, his knees knocking together so violently that the wood clattered against the platform. His face was pale, drained of blood, his eyes darting frantically across the sea of faces, looking for a pity that did not exist. But Thomas's memory did not linger on Silas alone. His gaze drifted up, above the heads of the common rabble, to the wooden balcony that overlooked the square. There, sitting on velvet cushions, were the local gentry. They held scented handkerchiefs to their noses to ward off the stench of the poor. They drank wine from silver goblets. They were chatting, laughing softly, treating the imminent death of a man with the same casual interest one might offer a juggler or a bear baiting. This was the cruelty that burned in Thomas's chest now, hotter than the plague boil under his arm. It was the realization that to the highborn, the suffering of the lowborn was not a tragedy. It was entertainment. Back in the memory, the drum roll ceased. The silence that fell over the square was heavy,
thick with morbid anticipation. The executioner did not offer a prayer. He simply stepped forward and shoved Silas off the ladder. There was no snap, no quick end. The rope went taut with a sickening creak, the sound of hemp fibers straining under dead weight. Silas did not fall far, perhaps 2 feet. The noose, a rough loop of heavy rope, cinched tight around his windpipe, but it did not crush the vertebrae. The dance began. Thomas watched, unable to look away as Silas thrashed. It was a primal, physical panic. His legs kicked out wildly, searching for purchase on the air, his feet running a race that had no finish line. His hands, bound behind his back, strained against the cords until the skin tore. The crowd gasped, a collective sound that was shock, part thrill. A woman near Thomas had covered her mouth, but her eyes remained wide, fixed on the swaying figure. The process of strangulation was slow.
It was a biological war of attrition. Thomas saw Silas's face transform. First, it flushed red as the blood was trapped in the head, unable to drain back down through the compressed veins. Then, as the oxygen starved his lungs, the red deepened to a bruised violet purple. His eyes bulged from their sockets, staring blindly at the sky that offered no salvation. His tongue, swollen and dark, protruded from his lips. The sound was the worst part, a wet, rasping wheeze, like a broken bellows trying to draw in air through a pinched straw. Herk, herk. The gentry on the balcony leaned forward. One of the ladies whispered something to a lord, and he chuckled, pointing at the dying man's convulsions. They were betting. They were gambling on how long the old weaver would last. Minutes dragged like hours. The violent thrashing slowed to sporadic twitches. The body's fight for survival was losing to the mechanics of the rope.
The bladder released, staining the weaver's trousers, a final humiliation that drew jeers from the boys in the front row. Finally, Silas went still. He hung there, a pendulum of meat and cloth, swaying gently in the breeze. The executioner stepped forward, grabbed the legs of the corpse, and pulled down hard, just to be sure. The neck cracked then, a dry snap that signaled the show was over. The crowd began to disperse, chatting about the quality of the hanging, comparing it to the one from the month before. They went back to their stalls, back to their lives, stepping over the invisible line between life and death as if it were nothing more than a puddle in the street. Thomas blinked, the memory shattering as his boots struck a loose stone on the road. He was back in the present. The cool air of the evening hit his face, but he was burning up. The battlefield was behind him, but the town square was in his heart. He looked down at his own hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from the sickness coursing through his veins. He thought of the misericorde, the dagger the squire had used to end the boy's suffering on the field. That had been a mercy, a quick, sharp end. What the lords did, what Lord Geoffrey represented, was the rope. They did not kill you quickly, they strangled you slowly. They squeezed the life out of you with taxes, with wars, with laws that made stealing bread a capital offense. They watched you kick and struggle and turn purple, and they sipped their wine while you died. Thomas felt the throbbing ache of the bubo under his armpit. It was a hard, hot lump, the size of a goose egg. It was death, distilled and concentrated. He was no longer just a tanner. He was no longer a conscript. He was the executioner now. But he would not bring a rope. He would not bring a sword. He was bringing the plague.
He looked toward the distant fires of the noble encampment, twinkling like fallen stars against the dark horizon. Lord Geoffrey was there, likely eating, likely drinking, safe in his tent. "You like to watch," Thomas whispered to the empty road, his voice rasping like a man with a noose around his neck.
Then watch this. He resumed his march. He was a walking gallows, and he was coming to give the nobility a front row seat to a death they could not hang.
Did you know that in the grand theater of medieval justice, a condemned nobleman would often kneel before the block and offer his executioner a heavy purse of gold coins? This wasn't an act of forgiveness, nor was it charity. It was a bribe. It was a desperate, trembling plea for a sharp blade and a true aim, because in those days, the swift, honorable death of the headsman's axe was a privilege that had to be bought. And if the headsman was drunk, inexperienced, or simply weak of arm, that privilege could vanish in a spray of blood and bone, turning a noble exit into a butchery far more gruesome than the peasant's rope. Thomas walked with the rhythm of a dead man, his boots sucking loudly at the mud of the road, each step a labor against the gravity of the fever burning in his blood. The memory of Silas the weaver and his strangling dance was fading, replaced by a colder, sharper recollection. The fever did strange things to a man's mind.
It peeled back the layers of time like the skin of an onion. As Thomas stared at the distant gray smudge of Lord Geoffrey's encampment on the horizon, the landscape around him shifted. The muddy road became a cobbled square. The silence of the countryside was replaced by the hushed, expectant murmur of 1,000 souls. He was back in the capital 3 years ago, not for a hanging this time, but for the main event. A traitorous baron, Thomas could not recall the name, only the velvet richness of his doublet, was to be shortened by a head. This was the promise of aristocracy, that even in death they were above the common choke of the rope. They were promised steel, they were promised speed. Thomas, then just a face in the crushing throng, watched the baron ascend the wooden scaffold. The man looked pale, his beard trimmed, his hands bound with silk rather than rough hemp. He maintained a stoic air, the arrogance of his bloodline holding his spine straight. Standing opposite him was the headsman. He was not a hooded phantom of death, but a large, sweating man named Miller, usually a smith by trade, drafted into the role because the town's executioner had died of the flux a week prior. Miller looked terrified. The axe in his hands, a heavy, double-bitted monstrosity of iron, seemed to tremble. Thomas watched the ritual. He saw the baron lean forward, whispering to Miller. He saw the flash of gold, the purse changing hands, the bribe for a clean cut. Miller nodded, pocketing the coin, wiping his clammy palms on his leather apron. The crowd held its breath. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket over the square. The baron knelt. He placed his neck upon the block, shifting his shoulders to find a comfortable position for his final moment. He murmured a prayer, his eyes squeezing shut, waiting for the sudden darkness. Miller raised the axe. The sun caught the edge of the blade. It looked dull. Thomas flinched in the memory as the axe came down. It did not sing through the air. It whistled, heavy and clumsy. Miller, perhaps overcome by the eyes of the gentry watching from the balconies, or perhaps simply unused to the way human muscle resists steel, checked his swing at the last second. The sound was not the clean thud of metal into wood. It was a wet, sickening crunch. The axe buried itself halfway into the baron's shoulder, cleaving through the collarbone and biting deep into the meat of the upper back. The scream that tore from the baron's throat was not human. It was the high-pitched shriek of a wounded animal, bubbling with shock and disbelief. The crowd gasped, a collective recoil of horror. The honorable death had instantly dissolved into a chaotic nightmare. "Strike again!" someone roared from the front row. Miller, panicked, eyes wide with the realization of his failure, wrenched the axe free. A fountain of bright arterial crimson sprayed across the scaffold, painting Miller's face in a grotesque mask. The Baron, half paralyzed but fully conscious, tried to scramble away, his head lolling sickeningly to the side, dragging his knees across the blood-slicked wood. "Hold him!" Miller screamed at his assistants. Two guards rushed forward, slipping in the gore, forcing the screaming, thrashing nobleman back down onto the block. The dignity was gone. The velvet doublet was a ruin. The prayers were replaced by gurgling pleas for Mother, for God, for mercy. Thomas remembered the sound of the second blow. Whack! It struck the back of the skull, shearing off the scalp but failing to sever the spine. The Baron stopped screaming, his body seizing in a violent convulsion, heels drumming a frantic tattoo against the planks. The crowd began to retch. Some turned away. Others, the ghouls, leaned closer. It took 3 more swings, 3 more hacking, sawing blows to finish the job. By the time the head finally rolled free, tumbling off the edge of the scaffold into the mud below, it was a mangled ruin of gristle and bone. The executioner stood panting, leaning on his axe, the gold in his pocket heavy and unearned. Walking the lonely road to Geoffrey's camp, Thomas touched the side of his own neck. The bubo there was hard and hot, a lump the size of a goose egg. It throbbed in time with his heartbeat. That is the truth of it, Thomas thought, his lips peeling back in a feverish grimace. The gold means nothing, the silk means nothing. The nobility convinced themselves that they were made of finer stuff, that their end would be as curated as their lives. They believed the lie of the clean death. They believed that because they drank from silver goblets, their blood would spill more politely than that of a weaver stealing cheese. Thomas looked down at his own hands. They were caked in dirt and dried blood from the skirmish days ago. He carried no axe.
He carried no sword. He carried only the pestilence coursing through his veins. He was the headsman now. But he would not offer Lord Geoffrey the mercy of a sharp blade. He would not accept a purse of gold to make it quick. The death Thomas brought was the dullest blade of all. It was the botched swing. It was the axe stuck in the shoulder, festering and rotting. The Black Death did not care for titles. It did not distinguish between the velvet of a lord and the rags of a serf. It was an inexperienced executioner, hacking away slowly, hour by hour, day by day, turning the body into a prison of agony before the final release. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the encampment ahead. He could see the banners now, snapping in the breeze, bright colors, heraldry of lions and eagles, symbols of power and pride. Thomas let out a low, raspy laugh that turned into a cough, rattling deep in his fluid-filled chest. He spat a wad of dark phlegm onto the road. "Save your gold, my lord," he whispered to the wind. "I am coming to collect, and I do not take bribes." He forced one foot in front of the other. The pain in his groin and armpits was excruciating, a fire that seared his nerves, but he welcomed it. It was the fuel, it was the grindstone sharpening his resolve. He was the botched execution, he was the horror on the scaffold, and he was walking straight through the front gate. Did you know that in the Middle Ages, innocence was often a death sentence disguised as a miracle? When the courts could not decide a man's guilt, they turned to the judicium Dei, the judgment of God. The accused was forced to hold a red-hot iron bar and carry it 9 paces. If the wound healed cleanly within 3 days, he was innocent. If it festered, he was guilty. But in a world without sanitation, where the bandages themselves were often rags stripped from the dead, almost no one healed. God, it seemed, found everyone guilty eventually.
Thomas could feel that same searing heat now, though no iron touched his skin. The heat came from within. It radiated from the dark, hard lumps swelling beneath his armpits and in his groin. The fever of the great pestilence was not a warm blanket. It was a forge, hammering him from the inside out. He stumbled through the underbrush, his boots sinking into the mud, his breath rattling like dry leaves in a drafty crypt. Every step sent a jolt of agony through his joints, a sensation that dragged his mind back from the foggy edge of delirium to a sharp, vivid memory of the past. He was no longer in the woods. He was back in the stone courtyard of the parish church years ago, standing amidst a silent, morbidly curious crowd. It was the trial of a local tanner named Wulfric, a man accused of stealing silver from the rectory. Wulfric had sworn his innocence until his throat was raw, but the local magistrate, a puppet of Lord Geoffrey's father, had demanded the ordeal of fire.
Thomas remembered the sound first. The bellows of the portable forge wheezed rhythmically, pumping air into the coals until the iron bar resting within them turned from dull gray to a translucent, angry orange. The heat rippling off the metal distorted the air, making the priest standing behind it look like a wavering mirage. Wulfric stood stripped to the waist, shivering not from cold, but from a terror that emptied the stomach. His hands were scrubbed with soap and holy water, a ritual cleansing that was the last kindness he would ever know. "Approach the judgment," the priest intoned. His voice was devoid of pity. To him, this was simple mechanics. God would protect the righteous. The physics of burning flesh were secondary to theology. Thomas watched, mesmerized by the horror, as Wulfric stepped forward. The tanner's eyes were wide, fixed on the glowing metal. The crowd held its collective breath. The silence was so absolute that the popping of the charcoal sounded like gunshots.
"Take it," the magistrate ordered. Wulfric reached out. His hand trembled, hovering over the iron. Then, with a sob that sounded like a child's cry, he clamped his fingers around the bar. The sound was instantaneous, a wet, high-pitched hiss, like raw meat thrown onto a scorching skillet. Smoke, thick and white, spiraled up from the palm of his hand. The smell hit the crowd a second later, the sweet, cloying, unmistakable scent of cooking pork. It was a smell that triggered a primal hunger in the gut before the mind realized what it was, leading to a wave of nausea. Wulfric did not scream immediately. The shock stole his voice. He took the first step. 1. The skin on his hand was already dead, turning from white to a charred black where it touched the metal. 2. 3. Now the scream came. It was a sound torn from the bottom of the lungs, a ragged tear in the air. He stumbled, his knees buckling, but the guards prodded him with spear butts. He had to walk the full 9 paces. 4, 5, 6. Molten fat dripped from his hand, sizzling as it hit the cold flagstones. Wulfric's face was a mask of contorted madness, his eyes rolling back, his jaw unhinged. 7, 8, 9. He dropped the iron. It clattered against the stone, still glowing, having stolen the life from the hand that held it. Wulfric collapsed, cradling the charred ruin of his limb, rocking back and forth, whimpering in a language of pure pain. But the horror was not over. That was the trick of the ordeal. The burn was merely the prologue. Thomas remembered watching the priest approach with a strip of linen. It was consecrated cloth, blessed at the altar, but Thomas had seen the altar boys dropping it on the dusty, rat-infested floor earlier that morning. They wrapped the charred, weeping hand tightly, sealing the heat and the dead flesh inside a cocoon of cloth. 3 days, the priest declared. In 3 days we shall see God's verdict.
The memory shifted, jumping forward in time as Thomas's fever spiked. He recalled the unbinding. 3 days later, Wulfric was dragged back to the steps. He looked worse than he had during the burning. His skin was gray, clammy with sweat. He was burning up, just as Thomas was burning now. The priest began to unwind the linen. The cloth was stuck, dried to the wound by a crust of yellow and brown fluids. The priest tugged. Wulfric shrieked. With a wet, tearing sound, the bandage came free. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The hand was no longer a hand. It was a swollen, bulbous mass of rot. The burn had not healed. It had invited the corruption in. Streaks of angry red ran up Wulfric's forearm, the poison of the infection traveling toward his heart. The smell of the burn was gone, replaced by the heavy, pungent odor of decay, the scent of a corpse left in the sun. "Guilty," the magistrate shouted, pointing at the festering wound.
God has rejected him. Wulfric was hanged an hour later, but as Thomas had watched the body swing, he realized the truth. The rope was a mercy. The infection, the God's fire in his blood, would have killed him slowly, agonizingly over the next week. The trial was rigged. The iron always burned. The bacteria always feasted. The verdict was death, either by the rope or by the rot. Thomas blinked, the memory dissolving into the gray mist of the forest. He looked down at his own body. He pulled open his tunic. Beneath his arm, a swelling the size of an apple throbbed. It was black in the center, ringed with angry red. It looked just like Wulfric's hand when the bandage was removed. Guilty, Thomas rasped to the empty trees, a dry, humorless laugh bubbling up his throat. According to the laws of the church, this mark meant God had judged him. He was unclean, he was corrupt. But Thomas was done with their laws. He was done with the priests who wrapped dirty rags around burns and called it divinity. He looked ahead. Through the thinning trees, he could see the smoke of campfires rising into the twilight sky. The banners of Lord Geoffrey snapped in the wind. Thomas realized then that he was no longer the accused. He was the iron. He was the red-hot bar glowing with the heat of the pestilence. He was the dirty bandage teeming with invisible death. He did not need to prove his innocence. He only needed to be touched. He would not be the man screaming as his flesh cooked. He would be the ordeal itself. He forced his legs to move, ignoring the screaming protest of his swollen lymph nodes. The pain was clarifying. It sharpened his hatred into a fine point. He would walk into Geoffrey's camp. He would let them handle him. He would breathe the verdict of God into their faces. Thomas stepped out of the tree line, a walking dead man carrying a judgment that no amount of prayer could heal.
The trial was about to begin, and this time the infection would claim them all.
Did you know that in the eyes of medieval law, the truth was rarely considered something a man possessed, but rather something that had to be harvested? It was widely believed that the human soul was too stubborn to be honest, and that pain was the only key capable of unlocking the lips of the wicked. They called it quaestio, or the questioning, but history knows it by a far darker name. And contrary to popular belief, these instruments were not designed to discover who was guilty. They were designed to ensure that even the innocent would eventually agree with the executioner. Thomas moved like a shadow detached from its caster.
The fever burned behind his eyes, a constant rhythmic thrumming that matched the pulse of the black swelling beneath his arm. Above him, the castle of Lord Geoffrey slept in ignorant luxury, but down here, in the bowels of the keep, the stone walls sweat cold moisture, and the air tasted of iron and old despair.
He had slipped past the outer guards, his movements silent, aided by the delirium that made his body feel weightless. He was not here to save anyone. That was a fool's errand, and Thomas was no longer a fool. He was here to witness. He was here to ensure that his hatred remained sharp enough to commit the deed he had planned. The descent was steep. The spiral stairs were worn smooth by the boots of jailers and the dragging heels of the condemned. With every step downward, the temperature dropped, and the smell of the pestilence, the rotting sweetness of the world above, was replaced by the acrid scent of fear. It was a smell distinct from all others, a mix of unwashed bodies, charcoal, and the copper tang of blood that had soaked into the floorboards for generations. Thomas halted in the darkness of an alcove. Ahead, the corridor opened into the interrogation chamber.
It was a high-ceilinged room, illuminated by the flickering orange glow of braziers that cast long, dancing shadows against the masonry. The heat down here was stifling, designed to make it hard to breathe, to strip a man of his defenses before a hand was even laid upon him. In the center of the room stood the altar of this twisted religion, the rack. It was a simple machine, really. A rectangular wooden frame raised off the ground with a roller at each end. Thomas watched, his breath shallow, as the jailer, a man with forearms like cured hams and a leather apron stained dark, adjusted the mechanism. On the table lay a prisoner. He was a wisp of a man, likely a peasant accused of poaching or perhaps speaking ill of the Lord. His wrists were bound to one roller, his ankles to the other. Thomas observed the mechanics of it with a cold, detached fascination. This was the justice that had killed Wulfric. It was mathematics applied to anatomy. The jailer inserted a wooden handle into the ratchet wheel. He didn't look angry. He didn't look malicious. He looked bored. This was the true horror of the dungeon. It was not a place of passion, but of industry. Click. The ratchet turned. The ropes grew taut. The prisoner gasped, his back arching off the wood as the slack was eaten up. The location of the silver, the jailer droned, his voice devoid of emotion. Confess, and the tension stops. I know nothing, the man wept, his voice cracking. I am a miller. I grind grain. Click. Thomas winced sympathetically, not out of pity, but because the sound of the rope tightening resonated with the tightness of his own infected skin. The rack was designed to stretch the human body beyond the limits set by nature. It targeted the ligaments, the fibrous bands that held bone to bone. Thomas knew the physiology. First, the shoulders would pop from their sockets with a sickening wet thud. The rotator cuffs would tear, rendering the arms useless flails of meat. Then, the strain would move to the hips, then the knees. If the questioner was skilled, he could stretch a man by 6 inches without killing him, leaving him a disjointed, ruined thing that would never walk again. Click, click. A scream tore through the damp air, bouncing off the stone walls, amplifying until it seemed to vibrate in Thomas's teeth. The sound was primal. It was the sound of a human being reduced to pure biology, stripped of dignity, hope, and language. The miller's elbows were visibly dislocated now, the skin around the joints turning a bruised purple as blood vessels burst beneath the surface. The silver, the jailer repeated, leaning on the lever. "I stole it!" the miller shrieked, sobbing uncontrollably. "I stole it! I buried it by the creek! I am a thief! Please, God, please stop!" The jailer paused. He looked at a scribe sitting in the corner, a thin man scratching ink onto parchment. "Write that down. He confesses to the theft." Thomas gripped the rough stone of the wall. He knew with absolute certainty that there was no silver. The miller had confessed to a lie, because the lie was the only thing that could stop the pain. The rack did not extract truth, it manufactured guilt. It was the same machinery that had condemned Wulfric to the fire. It was the same power that claimed God's will was behind the great pestilence. Thomas's gaze drifted to the other instruments lining the walls, lurking in the shadows like dormant beasts. There was the scavenger's daughter, an A-frame of iron hoops designed to do the opposite of the rack. Instead of stretching, it compressed. It forced the victim into a crouch, knees to chest, and squeezed until the blood was forced from the nose and ears by sheer internal pressure. And there, hanging on a hook, were the pears, metal devices shaped like the fruit, composed of expanding metal leaves. They were inserted into the body's orifices, mouths of liars or elsewhere for other crimes, and expanded by a screw until the jaw broke or internal organs ruptured. They were instruments of violation, designed to destroy the sanctity of the human form. Thomas felt a wave of nausea, but it was quickly overtaken by a surge of dark, feverish power. "They think they are the masters of pain," Thomas thought, looking at the jailer wiping his hands on a rag. "They think this wood and iron makes them gods over men's bodies." He touched the bubo under his arm. It was hot, hard as a stone, and throbbing with a venom that no torturer could replicate. The pain the jailer inflicted was external, crude and limited. But what Thomas carried, what Thomas was, that was absolute. He stepped back into the deeper shadows as the jailer began to loosen the wheel. The miller lay sobbing, his body lengthened and broken, a puppet with its strings cut. Thomas looked at the torture chamber one last time. He memorized the face of the jailer. He memorized the face of the scribe. "You use iron to break bones," Thomas whispered into the darkness, his voice too low to be heard over the prisoner's weeping. "But I bring a breaking that starts in the blood." He did not need a rack to destroy Lord Geoffrey's garrison. He did not need thumbscrews or fire. He simply needed to be among them. He was the instrument now. He was the Questio. Slowly, Thomas turned away from the scene. He would not intervene. The miller was already dead in every way that mattered, a broken man in a broken age. Thomas had to save his strength for the climb back up. He had to ascend to the great hall, to the kitchens, to the barracks. He had to deliver his own testimony. As he climbed the stairs, leaving the screams behind him, Thomas felt a strange sense of liberation. The dungeon had clarified everything. The world of men was built on cruelty and lies.
The laws were a farce, written in blood. He reached the top of the stairs and slipped through the heavy oak door, entering the bustling, torch-lit corridors of the upper keep. He kept his head down, clutching his cloak tight around his fever-racked body. He was a walking biological weapon, a vessel of divine wrath. And as he moved toward the heart of Lord Geoffrey's stronghold, Thomas smiled grimly. The interrogation was about to begin. Did you know that the human brain can remain conscious for several minutes after the body has been cut open? In the darkest chapters of medieval history, the law did not merely demand the death of a traitor, it demanded that he witness his own unmaking.
The punishment for high treason was designed to be a theater of agony, a precise surgical dismantling of a human being where death was not the immediate result, but the distant, coveted finish line. Thomas stood in the shadows of the gallery overlooking the inner courtyard of Lord Geoffrey's keep.
His skin burned with the fever that was slowly consuming him, a fire that matched the torchlight flickering below. The courtyard was packed. Nobles, guards, and servants had gathered, their breath misting in the cold night air, eyes fixed on the wooden platform erected in the center. They were not here for a simple beheading. That was a mercy reserved for the highborn. The man being dragged through the mud by a horse was the peasant Thomas had seen earlier, the broken soul who had confessed to a plot he likely never understood. He was to be made an example. He was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Thomas gripped the cold stone of the balustrade. His sweat left a damp, invisible residue upon the rock, a silent signature of the pestilence he carried. He watched as the prisoner, battered and muddy from being drawn across the cobblestones behind the horse, was hauled onto the scaffold. The executioner was a massive figure, hooded in black, his movements efficient and practiced.
He did not look like a murderer. He looked like a tradesman preparing for a day's labor. First came the rope. The crowd hushed as the noose was tightened. The executioner shoved the man off the ladder. There was no snap of the neck. That would have been too kind. The drop was short, calculated to strangle, not kill. The victim danced the desperate, airless jig, his legs kicking wildly as his face turned a chaotic shade of violet. Thomas watched the man's eyes bulge, the panic vibrating through the air. He counted the seconds. 10, 20, 30. Just as the man's struggles began to weaken, just as the black curtain of unconsciousness threatened to offer him peace, the executioner stepped forward with a knife. With a swift slash, the rope was cut. The prisoner collapsed onto the wooden planks, gasping, sucking in greedy, ragged breaths of air. He was alive, confused, terrified, but alive. To bring a man to the very edge of the void and then drag him back so he could feel the next part. The executioner and his assistants stripped the dazed man and strapped him to a wooden bench. The prisoner was fully conscious now, his eyes darting around, realizing with dawning horror that the hanging had only been the prologue. Thomas felt a wave of nausea, not from the gore, but from the sanctimonious nature of it all. Lord Geoffrey sat on a raised dais, sipping wine, watching this butchery as if it were a sermon. The drawing began. The executioner raised a curved blade, catching the torchlight. He did not strike with anger, he worked with the precision of a surgeon. He made a long vertical incision across the man's abdomen. The scream that tore from the prisoner's throat was primal, a sound that seemed to shred the very air of the courtyard. It was not just pain, it was the sound of a mind shattering. Because the man was still alive, his muscles contracted, his body fighting the invasion. The executioner reached inside. This was the drawing, the removal of the viscera. Thomas watched, unblinking, as the steam rose from the open cavity. The executioner pulled out a glistening coil of intestine, the loops steaming in the chill air. The prisoner, head propped up by the angle of the bench, looked down. He saw his own interior, the machinery of his life being unspooled while his heart still beat in his chest. The horror was absolute. The crowd leaned in, a mix of revulsion and fascination. The executioner took the organs and cast them into a brazier burning beside the block. The smell hit Thomas a moment later, the acrid, heavy scent of burning flesh. The prisoner shrieked again, a wet, gurgling sound as he smelled his own body being consumed by fire. He was witnessing his own funeral rites while trapped in a living hell.
"Behold the wages of treason," a herald shouted, his voice booming over the screams. But Thomas knew this wasn't justice, it was fear. It was a display of power meant to terrify the living by desecrating the dying. The man was fading now, his screams reducing to low, bubbling whimpers. The shock was finally overcoming the adrenaline. The executioner, sensing the audience's anticipation for the finale, reached high into the chest cavity. He sought the heart. With a brutal, wrenching motion, the organ was severed. The executioner held it aloft, dripping and dark in the torchlight. For a fraction of a second, the nerves fired one last time. The prisoner's eyes went wide, fixed on the piece of himself held above him, before the light finally, mercifully, left them. "God save the Lord," the crowd murmured, the ritual complete. The final stage, quartering, was merely mechanics. The axe fell, severing the head, and the body was divided into 4 parts to be sent to the corners of the fiefdom. But the man was gone. The pain was over. Thomas exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. The heat in his blood felt like it was boiling. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from a dark, crystallized purpose. Lord Geoffrey believed that cutting a man open was the ultimate power. He believed that controlling the body was controlling the world. He was wrong. Thomas turned away from the balcony, his hand sliding along the smooth wood of the doorframe, leaving another invisible smear of sweat and contagion. The executioner had used a knife to draw out the insides of one man. Thomas carried a weapon that would draw out the life of the entire castle. He would not need ropes or knives. He would not need a stage. He would move through them like a ghost, and the sickness he carried would be the executioner that no one saw coming until it was too late. He walked back into the corridor, heading deeper into the keep. The screams had stopped, but in the silence, the plague began to speak. Did you know that in medieval England, the concept of childhood innocence effectively ended at age 7? Under the eyes of the law, a second grader today would have been considered a fully responsible adult back then, capable of standing trial, facing torture, and even swinging from the gallows for stealing a piece of bread. There was no juvenile detention, no counseling, and certainly no mercy. There was only the dungeon and the labor that broke the body before it had even finished growing. Thomas moved away from the bloody spectacle in the courtyard, the metallic tang of the executed peasant's blood still coating the back of his throat. His vision blurred, swimming with the heat of the fever that ravaged his own veins, but his mind possessed a terrifying, crystalline clarity. He was no longer just a refugee. He was a vessel, a walking biological weapon. He slipped through the heavy oak doors of the service wing, leaving the cheering crowds behind. Here, the air was thick with the smell of rendered fat, wet wool, and old sweat. This was the engine room of Lord Geoffrey's luxury, and it was fueled by those too small to fight back. Thomas pressed himself into the shadows of the scullery archway, his breath rattling wetly in his chest. Before him lay a scene that made the brutality of the executioner seem almost clinical by comparison. The room was a cavern of steam and noise, but the workers scurrying across the slick stone floors were not men. They were children. Dozens of them. Some looked no older than 5, their small frames draped in rags that were little more than grey sacks. They did not play. They did not laugh. They moved with the hunched, fearful efficiency of beaten dogs. One Thomas watched a girl, perhaps 8 years old, hauling a cauldron of boiling water that looked heavy enough to crush her. Her arms were thin as reeds, trembling violently. Scalds and burns mapped her skin in angry red patches.
a geography of accidents that were treated as failures. "Move it, you little wretch!" a voice boomed. It was Grendel, the master of the scullery. He was a man of immense girth, his apron stained with grease and blood, wielding a wooden ladle as if it were a scepter of war. He did not see children when he looked at them. He saw miniature adults who ate too much and worked too little. The girl stumbled. The water sloshed, splashing onto the floor and searing her bare foot. She let out a sharp, high-pitched cry, dropping the cauldron. It clanged against the stone, the hot water pooling rapidly. Thomas flinched, his hand instinctively going to the dagger hidden in his tunic, but he stopped. He had to be smarter. He had to be the ghost. Grendel descended upon the girl not with concern, but with fury. He seized her by the ear, hauling her up until she was standing on her tiptoes, tears carving clean lines through the soot on her face.
"Clumsiness is a sin," Grendel spat, his face inches from hers. "And waste is a crime. That water cost labor to draw and wood to heat. You will pay for it."
"Please, master," the girl squeaked, her voice trembling. "It slipped. My hands, the oil."
"Excuses are for the weak," Grendel roared. "The law does not care if your hands are oily. If a man drops a load, he is docked pay. You have no pay to dock, so you will pay in skin." He dragged her toward the heavy wooden work table. Thomas watched, his heart hammering against his ribs as the other children kept working. They didn't look up. They didn't dare. To witness the punishment was to invite it upon oneself. They kept scrubbing, chopping, and hauling, their eyes fixed on the floor, terrified ghosts haunting their own lives. Grendel grabbed a switch of braided leather hanging by the hearth. He bent the girl over the table. There was no hesitation, no moral pause to consider her age.
In this castle, she was just a small, inefficient servant. The first strike cracked through the humid air like a thunderclap. The girl screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that pierced through the din of the kitchen. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, the fever spiking hot behind his eyelids. He felt the sickness surging within him, the bubonic death waiting to be shared. He looked at his own hands, trembling, covered in the invisible residue of the plague. "This is justice," he thought bitterly. "Their law says a child is a man, then let the castle die like one." He waited until Grendel had finished his discipline and shoved the sobbing, limping girl back toward the washing basins. The master of the scullery turned away, wiping sweat from his brow, panting from the exertion of his cruelty. He reached for a pitcher of wine sitting on a side table to refresh himself. Thomas moved. He didn't run. He flowed like a draft of cold air. As he passed the side table, hidden by the pillars and the steam, he ran his hand along the rim of the pitcher. He coughed, a deep, wet, hacking sound that he stifled into his palm, and then wiped that same palm across the handle of the ladle Grendel used to taste the soups. He moved deeper into the room, a phantom of contagion. He saw a boy, no older than 6, struggling to turn a massive roasting spit. The heat from the fire was blistering, singing the hair on the boy's arms. The boy was crying silently, his tears drying before they hit his cheeks. He was chained to the post by his ankle, a precaution against running away. Thomas knelt beside the boy in the shadows behind the spit. The boy jumped, eyes widening in terror, expecting a blow. "Quiet," Thomas whispered, his voice raspy. The boy stared at him, eyes hollowed out by exhaustion. He looked like an old man trapped in a child's body. Are you the Reaper?" the boy whispered, a strange hope in his voice. The question shattered Thomas's heart. A 6-year-old should fear the reaper, not pray for him. "No," Thomas said softly, "but I am his messenger." Thomas reached out. He didn't offer a key. He had none. He didn't offer freedom. There was nowhere to go. Instead, he placed his fever-hot hand gently on the boy's shoulder. It was a dark benediction. "You won't have to turn the wheel much longer," Thomas promised, a tear leaking from his own eye. "The sleep is coming. For him," he nodded toward Grendel, who was now gulping wine from the infected pitcher, "and for this whole cursed stone pile." It was a horrific mercy. Thomas knew that by spreading the infection here, the children would likely die too. The plague did not discriminate. But in a world where 7-year-olds were hanged and 6-year-olds were chained to fires, perhaps the end was the only liberation available. Thomas stood up, his legs shaking.
He walked along the rows of prepared food, the platters of roasted pheasant, the bowls of fresh fruit destined for Lord Geoffrey's high table. He touched them. He breathed on them. He let the sweat from his brow drip onto the rim of a silver chalice. He was weaving a web of death, invisible and inescapable. As he slipped out of the scullery, back into the cool darkness of the corridor, he heard Grendel shouting again, the crack of the leather whip echoing off the stone walls. "Work! You are not children! You are servants of the Lord!" Thomas smiled grimly in the dark. "Not for long," he whispered to the stone walls. "Not for long." Did you know that during the great plagues of history, the first victims to fall often weren't the ones with the fever? Before the buboes swelled or the lungs collapsed, it was the lonely who died first. When fear rots the mind before the sickness rots the body, society frantically searches for a monster to blame.
And almost always, that monster looks exactly like your grandmother. Thomas left the heavy iron gates of Lord Geoffrey's castle behind him, the taste of bile and bile-black resolve still coating his tongue. He had just condemned a room full of children to death, viewing it as a kindness compared to the slow torture of their daily lives. But as he descended the muddy, winding path toward the village outskirts, he realized that the castle was merely the head of the snake. The poison of cruelty ran through the entire body of the land. The fog was thick here, clinging to the low-lying hovels that sat apart from the main village. These were the fringe dwellings, the homes of those who did not fit. The lepers, the charcoal burners, and the widows who had outlived their usefulness to their families. Thomas pulled his hood lower. His skin felt hot, a furnace burning beneath his rags, but his shivering had ceased. He was no longer fighting the pestilence. He was piloting it. A commotion ahead drew his attention. It wasn't the rhythmic clang of industry or the chatter of a market. It was the sharp, jagged noise of a pack of dogs cornering a wounded animal. Thomas stepped off the path, blending into the shadow of a gnarled oak tree. Through the mist, he saw a dilapidated cottage. The thatch was rotting, covered in moss, and the door hung loosely on leather hinges. A garden of scraggly herbs, rosemary, sage, and nightshade, struggled against the frost in the front yard. A group of 6 villagers stood before the hut. They were not soldiers or lords, they were common folk. A baker with flour on his apron, a tanner with stained hands, and 2 sturdy farm wives. They were people who, just a week ago, might have traded eggs for a poultice. Now they held stones and pitchforks. "Come out, you hag!" the tanner bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "My cow dropped dead this morning." "The milk was black. We know it was you." The door creaked open, not by force, but by a trembling hand. An old woman stepped into the light.
She was tiny, her spine bent so severely by decades of labor that she looked like a question mark carved from bone. Her hair was a wispy white halo around a scalp spotted with age, and her hands were twisted knots of arthritis. This was Agnes. She had delivered half the babies in the village 30 years ago. Now she was just a mouth to feed, a burden, a stranger. "I have done nothing," Agnes whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering on stone. "I only have herbs for the joint pain. Please." "Liar!" one of the farm wives shrieked. She stepped forward and spat, a glob of saliva landing on Agnes's cheek. "I saw you whispering to the cat. I saw you looking at the moon 3 nights past. You've cursed the valley. That's why the sickness is coming." Thomas watched, his heart thudding, a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. It was a fascinating, horrific biology. The plague he carried was a simple organism, blind and indifferent, but the plague they carried, the hysteria, was malicious. It targeted the weak. Because Agnes lived alone, she was suspicious. Because she was old and ugly, she was frightening. Because she knew how to mix herbs, she was dangerous. It was the logic of frightened children in adult bodies. "Burn her out!" the baker shouted, hefting a rock. He threw it. The stone struck Agnes in the shoulder. It wasn't a lethal blow, but on a frame so frail, the impact was devastating. She crumbled to the mud with a sharp cry, clutching her arm. The sound seemed to embolden them. The mob mentality took hold, a frenzy of release. If they could just destroy this one thing, they believed, the terrifying, invisible death approaching their village would pass them by. They surged forward. They didn't strike her again immediately. Instead, they tore at her world. The tanner kicked over her rain barrel. The women began ripping up the garden, tearing the sage and rosemary out by the roots and trampling them into the muck. They were erasing her existence. Thomas stepped out of the shadows. He did not shout, he did not draw a weapon. He simply walked toward them with the steady, unnatural gait of a man who has already died and is merely waiting for his body to catch up. The atmosphere shifted. The villagers sensed him before they saw him. The cold radiating from Thomas seemed to drop the temperature of the clearing by 10 degrees. "Get back," Thomas rasped. His voice was wet, rattling with the fluid beginning to fill his lungs. The baker spun around, ready to threaten the intruder, but he froze. Thomas's face was pale, his eyes sunken into dark violet bruises. Sweat slicked his forehead despite the chill. He looked like a walking corpse. "Who are you?" the tanner demanded, though his grip on the pitchfork wavered.
"I am the answer to your prayers," Thomas said, a dark smile touching his cracked lips. "You look for the source of the death? You look for the curse?" He stepped closer. The villagers recoiled, their instinctual fear of the sick overriding their anger at the witch. "Leave her," Thomas commanded softly. "She is not the one you should fear. She deals in roots and berries. I deal in the end of days." He coughed then, a deliberate, wet, hacking sound that sprayed a fine mist into the air between him and the mob. The silence that followed was absolute. The villagers stared at the droplets, then at Thomas's fever-bright eyes. Panic, pure and primal, replaced their aggression. They didn't care about the witch anymore. They scrambled backward, tripping over themselves, turning and fleeing back toward the safety of their homes, carrying the invisible seeds of Thomas's breath with them. Thomas stood alone in the clearing. He turned to the mud where Agnes lay. She was trying to push herself up, weeping softly. She looked up at him, her eyes milky with cataracts, terrified. She expected him to finish what the mob had started. Thomas knelt. The mud soaked his knees. He reached out, not with violence, but with a strange, terrible tenderness. He took her gnarled hand in his fever-hot grip. "Did they hurt you, Mother?" he asked. "They took my garden," she whispered, her mind unable to process the violence, fixation on the small tragedy of her herbs. "They trampled the sage." "I know," Thomas said. "The world has no use for gardens anymore." He looked at her. He saw the poverty, the isolation. He saw a woman who had been discarded by the very people she had once healed, left to rot on the edge of town until she became a convenient scapegoat for their terrors. If he left her, they would return tomorrow with fire. They would burn her alive to cleanse the village. That was the justice of men. Thomas squeezed her hand.
He could feel the pulse of the plague jumping from his skin to hers. It was a transfer of energy, a dark benediction. "I cannot build your garden back," Thomas said, his voice thick with sorrow. "But I can promise you that you will not burn. You will simply go to sleep, and when you wake, there will be no more cold, no more hunger, and no more neighbors." Agnes stopped crying. She looked at him, her cloudy eyes searching his face. Perhaps she was senile, or perhaps she possessed the deep, intuitive wisdom of the dying. She didn't pull her hand away. She squeezed back. "Thank you," she breathed. Thomas stayed with her until her breathing steadied, until he was sure the contact had been long enough to ensure infection. He had saved her from the stake by gifting her the pestilence. It was a horrific choice, the only kind left in a world gone mad. He stood up, his joints screaming in protest. He looked toward the village, where the baker and the tanner were fleeing. They would bring the sickness to their families tonight. The witch would outlive them by a day or two, perhaps, but they were all walking the same path now. Thomas turned his back on the ruined cottage and the doomed woman. He continued his walk toward the heart of the town. The elderly had been the first to be cast aside, but Thomas would ensure that before the end, everyone, young, old, rich, poor, would be held in the same cold embrace. He was the great equalizer, and he had much work left to do. Did you know that when a human body is subjected to the extreme heat of a pyre, the muscles contract in such a violent, specific way that the victim appears to be raising their fists in a boxing stance? Modern science calls this the pugilist attitude, a gruesome biological reaction to the drying of muscle fibers. But to the religious zealots of the 14th century, this was not biology. To them, it was the physical manifestation of the demon fighting to remain inside the flesh, struggling against the holy fire that sought to rip it out. They believed the fire was not a punishment, but a surgical tool, a way to burn away the sin so the soul could rise, clean and screaming, into the arms of God. Thomas had left Agnes to the mercy of the fever, a quiet death in the dark. But as he drifted like a ghost into the next township, the market square offered no such quietude. Here, the air did not smell of the sweet, rotting scent of the pestilence. It smelled of pitch, dry pine, and the terrifying, savory heaviness of roasting meat. The town was crowded. Panic over the spreading plague had paradoxically driven people together, herding them into the arms of the church, desperate for a scapegoat to explain why God was killing their children. They had found 3. Thomas stood at the back of the throng, his hood pulled low. His own skin was hot to the touch, the buboes beneath his arms throbbing in time with his heartbeat, but he felt a strange, detached calm. He watched the spectacle not as a man, but as a vessel. In the center of the square, 3 wooden stakes had been driven deep into the cobblestones. Bundles of faggots, dried branches, and straw were piled high around the waists of the condemned. There were 2 men and 1 woman. They were not witches in the way Agnes was accused of being. They were simply others.
Perhaps Jews, perhaps travelers who spoke the wrong dialect, or perhaps just neighbors who had looked at a priest with insufficient fear. It didn't matter. To the crowd, they were the reason the sickness had come. A high inquisitor stood upon a raised wooden dais. He was a gaunt man, his eyes burning with a fever that had nothing to do with the plague. He held a silver cross high, catching the midday sun. "Behold!" The inquisitor's voice cracked like a whip over the murmuring crowd. "We do not hate these flesh sacks. We love the souls trapped within them. The corruption of the world has taken root in their blood and brought the great mortality upon us. We must be the physicians. We must be the cauterizing iron." The crowd swayed, mesmerized. They were terrified, and their terror made them cruel. They needed to believe that if they burned these 3 strangers, the invisible killer stalking their homes would vanish. The torch was brought forward.
Thomas watched the sensory horror unfold with unblinking eyes. The first sensation was not sight, but sound. As the torch touched the oil-soaked straw, there was a whoosh, a sudden intake of breath by the fire itself. Then came the crackling, like the breaking of 1,000 dry bones. The flames climbed with terrifying speed. The outline demanded the sensory experience of this agony, and the reality was far worse than any painting of hell. The heat hit the crowd first, a physical wall that forced the front rows to stumble backward. The air above the pyres began to shimmer, distorting the faces of the condemned, so they looked like melting wax figures before they even began to burn. Then the screaming began. It was a sound that scraped against the inside of the skull. The woman on the left began to shriek, a high, thin sound that rose in pitch until it simply cut off, not because she had died, but because the superheated air had seared her throat, stealing her voice.
She thrashed against the ropes, the hemp biting into her charring skin. The sensory details of the burning were overwhelming. The smell changed rapidly. First, the sharp tang of wood smoke and sulfur, then the sickeningly sweet, heavy odor of burning hair, and finally, the smell that made the stomach turn and the mouth water in a revolt of instinct, the smell of cooking pork. It was the scent of humanity being reduced to carbon. Thomas saw the skin of the central victim, a young man, begin to blister. Great bubbles of fluid rose on his chest and arms, glowing orange in the firelight before bursting, the fluids hissing as they hit the flames. The fire was stripping them layer by layer. It was an unmaking. "See how the sin leaves them," the inquisitor roared, his face illuminated by the inferno. "See how the devil struggles!" And indeed, the bodies were moving. The heat was causing the tendons to shorten and snap. The victim's legs jerked upward in a grotesque dance. Their arms, blackening and skeletal, curled inward, fists clenching tight, rising toward their faces in that pugilist attitude. "They fight the judgment," a woman in the crowd screamed, clutching her rosary. "Burn it out of them!" "Salvation!" the crowd chanted, a low rumble that competed with the roar of the fire. "Salvation through fire!" They truly believed it. That was the horror that chilled Thomas more than the flames. They believed that this agony, this boiling of blood and popping of eyes, was an act of divine love.
They justified the torture as a necessary transaction, temporary agony for eternal bliss. It was the ultimate arrogance of man to think he could burn his way into God's grace. Thomas felt a cough bubbling in his own chest. He swallowed it down, tasting copper. He looked at the faces around him. They were flushed with the heat of the fire, their eyes wide, pupils dilated. They were inhaling the smoke. They were inhaling the ash of the victims.
And without knowing it, they were inhaling the breath of Thomas. He saw a mother lifting her child up to see the burning better, pointing at the dying, twitching shapes in the fire. "Look," she whispered, "that is what happens to the wicked." Thomas felt a profound, dark pity. The fire was cruel, loud, and theatrical. It was a human invention. But the pestilence was silent. It was fair. It did not care if you were a priest or a heretic, a saint or a sinner. It did not need ropes or stakes. As the fires began to die down, leaving only 3 charred, unrecognizable pillars of carbon standing against the gray sky, the crowd began to disperse. They looked exhausted, spiritually spent, believing they had done their duty. They believed they were safe now. Thomas stepped aside to let them pass. He brushed shoulders with the Inquisitor as the man stepped down from the dais. "God be with you," the Inquisitor muttered, wiping soot from his brow, not looking at Thomas.
"And with you," Thomas whispered, his voice raspy with the sickness. He walked through the lingering smoke, the smell of death clinging to his clothes. The fire had purged nothing. It had only fed the darkness in their hearts. But Thomas carried the true fire in his blood, a fire that burned cold, a fire that would not distinguish between the judged and the judged. He walked deeper into the town, touching the wooden stalls, brushing against the silk of the merchants, coughing gently into the open air. The execution was over, but the sentence had just been passed on them all. Did you know that the average human being can survive for nearly 3 weeks without food, but the veneer of civilization collapses after only 9 missed meals? It is a terrifying calculus. We like to believe that our morality, our laws, and our dignity are ironclad, but history has proven time and again that they are merely rented, and the rent is paid in calories.
When the belly is truly empty, man does not just starve, he devolves. Welcome to Part 12. The fires in the market square had long since burned down to cold ash, blowing across the cobblestones like gray snow. The 3 others who had been incinerated were gone, but the salvation the crowd had prayed for never arrived. Instead, the city gates slammed shut. It was not merely a quarantine, it was a siege. The armies of the neighboring territories, terrified that the pestilence would spill over into their lands, had encircled the city walls. They dug trenches and raised palisades, not to conquer, but to contain. No one went out, no one came in. The supply lines were severed with the brutal efficiency of an executioner's axe. Thomas, feverish and nursing the tender, swelling lumps beneath his arms, watched from the shadows of the ramparts as the city began to eat itself. The first week was a time of rationing and nervous prayer. The second week was a time of anger.
By the 3rd week, the silence of the hunt had descended. Thomas moved through the narrow, winding streets like a ghost. The sickness in his blood made him light-headed, giving the world a surreal, floating quality. He watched the regression of humanity with a detached, clinical fascination.
The bakeries had been looted days ago, the flour scraped from the floorboards. Now the people looked to lower sources of sustenance. He saw a merchant, once a man of considerable girth and influence, sitting in the gutter, weeping silently as he boiled a strip of leather cut from his own boot. The stench was acrid, a chemical smell of tannins and cured hide, but the man chewed on the tough, unyielding strip with the ferocity of a wolf. He was trying to trick his stomach, to give the acid something to work on other than the lining of his own gut. But leather offers no life. As the days bled into a haze of gray fog, the city's vermin became the new currency. Thomas watched a transaction in an alleyway that chilled him more than the fever. A woman, her face gaunt and her eyes hollowed out by despair, held out a gold necklace, a heavy, intricate thing that would have once bought a horse. In exchange, a street urchin handed her a dead rat. The creature was stiff, its fur matted with grime, dangling by its tail. The woman did not recoil. She snatched it with trembling hands, clutching the vermin to her chest as if it were a holy relic. In the economics of starvation, gold is a heavy stone, but meat, even diseased, stringy meat, is life. Thomas walked on. He saw the piles of bones in the courtyards. First, the livestock had gone, then the stray dogs, then the beloved house cats. Now the city was silent. There were no barks, no meows, no chirping birds. Every living thing that could be caught had been consumed. The silence was heavy, broken only by the low groans of the dying and the constant rhythmic thumping of the siege engines outside the walls. The army outside was impatient. Starvation was too slow a weapon for them. They wanted to ensure the city broke completely, that the spirit was crushed along with the body. Thomas found himself near the eastern wall when the sky darkened. He looked up, squinting against the pale sun. A trebuchet, a massive engine of war constructed of timber and counterweights, had released its payload from the fields beyond the wall. Usually, these machines hurled stones meant to shatter masonry, but the object arcing through the air was soft. It did not hum like a rock, it flapped. It struck the cobblestones of the plaza with a sickening, wet thud. It did not shatter the ground, it shattered itself. Thomas stepped closer, the crowd parting in horror. It was a human body. The corpse was bloated, the skin a mottled canvas of black and purple. The buboes on its neck were the size of apples, some having burst upon impact, spraying a vile, dark fluid across the stones. The besieging army was not throwing rocks, they were throwing the dead. They were collecting the plague victims from their own camps and launching them over the walls, returning the pestilence to the city in a rain of rotting flesh. It was biological warfare in its most primitive, nightmarish form. Another thud echoed nearby, then another. The sky was raining death. A body struck a tiled roof, sliding down and landing in a water trough, instantly poisoning the supply. The people, already weakened by hunger, scattered like ants, screaming as the corrupted flesh of their enemies rained down upon them. Thomas stood still amidst the chaos. He watched a man driven mad by hunger stare at the broken ruin of a corpse that had just landed. For a second, a terrifying second, Thomas saw the glint of appetite in the man's eyes before revulsion took over. The line between man and beast had been erased. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of old death, burst bowels, and the sulphurous reek of the plague itself. The very air became a weapon. The miasma, as the doctors called it, was now thick enough to taste. Thomas looked down at his own hands. The black spots were spreading across his palms. He realized the irony of the siege. The army outside thought they were trapping the disease inside, bombarding the city to hasten its demise. They didn't understand that the city was already dead. The hunger had hollowed them out, and the plague was merely filling the void. He watched as a stray dog, one of the few survivors, perhaps hidden away until now, scuttled toward the wreckage of a catapulted body. It began to feed on the infected flesh. A starving child, seeing the dog, picked up a rock and crept toward it, not to save the corpse, but to eat the dog. The cycle of consumption was complete. The living ate the dead, the strong ate the weak, and the plague ate them all. Thomas felt a strange, delirious laugh bubble up in his throat, but it emerged as a dry cough. He was no longer just a witness, he was part of the ecosystem of rot. He turned away from the wall, walking back into the heart of the starving city. There was no need to run. The walls that kept them in also kept the horror close, intimate and inescapable. The siege would end eventually. The gates would open, but there would be no one left to walk out.
Did you know that during the absolute peak of the Black Death, the mortality rate became so catastrophic that the Pope was forced to consecrate the entire River Rhone? There was simply no earth left to hold the bodies, and the churchyards were vomiting up their dead. The holy ground was full, the gravediggers were dead, and the very concept of a Christian burial, the final dignity of a human life, had to be abandoned in favor of industrial disposal. This is the story of how a civilization forgot how to say goodbye. The siege engines outside the walls had fallen silent, but not because of a truce. The armies surrounding the city were dying just as quickly as those trapped within it. But for Thomas, the silence was heavier than the roar of any catapult. Thomas walked, or rather shuffled, through the main thoroughfare of the district. The agony in his groin and armpits, where the hard black tumors had formed, was a pulsating rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. Each step sent a shock wave of fever through his blood. He looked down at his hands. The tips of his fingers were turning the color of charcoal, the necrosis setting in while he was still breathing. He was a dead man walking, observing a city of ghosts. A week ago, the streets had been filled with the screams of the starving and the shouts of the desperate. Now there was a heavy, suffocating quiet. The starvation had weakened them, but the pestilence was finishing the job with terrifying efficiency. To his left, the great doors of a merchant's manor stood wide open. In times of peace, guards would have beaten any peasant who dared look upon the facade. Now Thomas saw the master of the house slumped across the threshold. He was draped in velvet crimson robes, the fabric worth more than Thomas would have earned in 10 lifetimes. But the plague did not care for velvet. The merchant's face was swollen beyond recognition, his tongue protruding black and thick from his mouth.
Beside him lay a chest of spilled silver coins, scattered across the cobblestones like common gravel. A stray dog, rib-thin and mangy, sniffed at the coins, found them inedible, and moved to sniff the merchant's hand instead. Thomas stepped over the silver. It meant nothing now. The economy of the city had shifted from gold to breath, and everyone was bankrupt. He made his way toward the cathedral square, drawn by a morbid curiosity to see if God still lived there. The scene that greeted him was a testament to the total collapse of human order. The cathedral, once the sanctuary of hope, had become a warehouse for the dead. The great wooden doors were barred, not to keep people out, but to keep the smell in. However, the overflow had spilled into the square. There were no individual graves. There were no wooden coffins. The carpenters were dead, and even if they weren't, there was no time to build boxes for this many bodies.
Instead, the cobblestones had been ripped up to expose the earth beneath. Thomas watched, leaning heavily against a stone fountain that had long since run dry. A group of 4 men, their faces wrapped in vinegar-soaked rags to ward off the miasma, were dragging bodies toward a massive, jagged trench cut through the center of the market square. These were the bikini, the body carriers, men who, in their desperation or madness, performed the work no one else would touch, often for exorbitant fees they would never live to spend. They did not carry the bodies with reverence. They dragged them by the ankles, heads bouncing sickeningly against the stones. Thomas watched as they hauled a woman in a fine silk dress and tossed her into the pit. She landed atop a blacksmith whose leather apron was stained with the dark purge fluids of the sickness. A moment later, a child, no older than 5, was thrown in to fill the gap between them. It was a lasagna of human decomposition.
The traditional rites, the washing of the body, the wake, the prayers, the procession had vanished. To gather for a funeral was to invite death to take the mourners next. The social hierarchy that had defined their world for centuries had been erased. In the pit, the noble rot touched the peasant rot. The bishop lay face down in the mud beside the thief. The plague was the great equalizer, stripping away titles and wealth until only the biological reality of meat and bone remained. "Bring out your dead!" a voice croaked, though it was barely a whisper. A cart rattled past Thomas. It was piled high, a mound of limbs and torsos, tangled together like caught fish. An arm dangled from the side, swaying with the motion of the wheels. Thomas recognized the ring on the finger. It belonged to the city magistrate, a man who had sentenced Thomas's brother to the stocks years ago. Now he was just another log on the fire. Thomas felt a wave of dizziness and slid down to sit at the base of the fountain. The smell was a physical weight, a sweet, cloying stench of rotting flowers and old blood that coated the back of his throat. A priest stumbled into the square. He was young, his cassock stained and torn. He held a wooden cross, waving it vaguely toward the open pit. He tried to mutter the In Paradisum, the prayer for the dying, but his voice cracked. He wasn't praying for the bodies in the trench. He was babbling, his mind broken by the sheer scale of the atrocity. There were too many souls to save, and the gates of heaven must surely be jammed by the traffic. The priest stopped, looked at Thomas, and his eyes widened in horror, not at Thomas, but at the nothingness. The young cleric dropped the cross, fell to his knees, and began to weep into his hands. He did not weep for the dead. He wept because he was still alive. Thomas looked away. The sight of the mass grave, the plague pit, was the final evidence that the world had ended. This wasn't just death, it was the erasure of history. These people would have no headstones. Their names would not be recorded in the parish registers because the scribes were dead too. They were becoming part of the geology of the city, a layer of bone and silence that would sit beneath the streets forever. A heavy coughing fit overtook Thomas, racking his body with such violence that he tasted copper. He spat into the dust. The spittle was black. He looked at the trench again. The bikini were sprinkling a thin layer of lime and dirt over the current layer of bodies, barely covering the faces before preparing to stack the next row. It was efficient. It was cold. It was necessary. The social contract had been torn up. There was no law, no king, no father, no mother. There was only the hunger of the bacteria. The city was no longer a place of human habitation. It was a feeding ground. Thomas closed his eyes, listening to the dull thud of bodies hitting the earth. He realized, with a strange detached calm, that he didn't want to die in his hovel. He didn't want to rot alone in the dark.
He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling like newborn foals. He would not wait for the cart. He would not wait to be dragged by his ankles. If the world had become a grave, he would walk into it with his eyes open. He took a step toward the pit, the fever dreaming in his mind, turning the gray sky into a swirling vortex of black clouds. The bells of the cathedral hung silent in their towers, huge tongues of bronze that had been struck dumb by the magnitude of the slaughter. There was no one left to ring them.
Did you know that during the height of the medieval era, the average life expectancy for a commoner was often barely 30 years, and that wasn't just because of disease, it was because the very structure of society was built like a machine designed to crush the human spirit. We look back at castles and knights with a sense of romantic wonder, but the reality was that for 1,000 years, Europe was a slaughterhouse, where the poor were fuel for the fires of the powerful. To understand the true history of mortality, we must look not at the kings in their silk, but at the silence of the mass graves. Thomas stood at the precipice of the abyss. The trench before him was a jagged wound in the earth, stretching through the center of the town square, a place that had once hosted markets and festivals, now repurposed as the throat of the underworld. The smell was not merely a scent, it was a physical barrier, a wall of putrefaction, lime and wet earth that made the air thick and oily against the skin. He did not tremble. The fever raging through his blood had burned away the capacity for fear, leaving only a cold, crystalline clarity. His legs, swollen and blackened by the necrosis eating him from the feet up, felt like lead weights, yet they obeyed his command. Around him, the corpse carriers, men with rag masks and dead eyes, paused in their grim labor. They were accustomed to dragging the unwilling or lifting the limp, not watching a dying man march to his own burial. Thomas took a step, then another. The mud at the edge of the pit was slick with fluids that had no place outside the human body. He looked down into the tangle of limbs, the faces frozen in final screams or slack-jawed resignation. There were neighbors down there. There was the baker who had given him extra crusts. There was the priest who had wept until he ran dry of tears. They were no longer people. They were debris in the wake of a biological storm. With a final rattling breath that tasted of copper and bile, Thomas stepped forward. Gravity took him. He slid down the slope of wet clay, coming to rest against the cold shoulder of a stranger. He did not fight for space. He simply closed his eyes, curling inward, reclaiming the only thing left to him, the timing of his departure. As the darkness began to encroach on his peripheral vision, the screams of the city above faded into a dull hum. The pain, sharp and tearing for so long, began to dull into a heavy numbness. Thomas died before the next cartload of dirt covered him. But his death was merely one syllable in a long, agonizing sentence that history had been writing for centuries. As the earth swallowed Thomas, we must pull back, up and away from the pit, away from the plague-stricken city, to view the tapestry of this era in its entirety.
The Black Death was the crescendo, the violent climax of a world that had normalized suffering to a terrifying degree. The plague did not destroy a paradise, it broke a purgatory. For generations, the existence of a person like Thomas was defined by a fragility that is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. The medieval world was an ecosystem of institutionalized cruelty. It was a time when the value of a human life was weighed against the harvest of a turnip field and found wanting. The hierarchy was absolute. God above the king above the Lord, and the Lord standing with an iron boot on the neck of the peasant. Think of the instruments of justice we have witnessed throughout this journey: the rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden. These were not the inventions of madmen hiding in basements. They were public institutions funded by the state and blessed by the clergy. Pain was the currency of control.
To maintain order in a world of scarcity, those in power felt it necessary to make the destruction of the human body a public spectacle. If you stole bread, you lost a hand. If you spoke against the crown, you lost your tongue. If you worshipped the wrong way, you burned. This uncheckered abuse of power created a psychological landscape of perpetual terror. A peasant did not plan for the future was a dark room. One bad harvest meant starvation. One angry whim of a local baron meant the gallows. One invisible flea meant the end of your bloodline. There was no safety net, no appeal to human rights, no concept of dignity inherent to existence. You existed solely to serve the machinery above you, and when you broke, you were discarded. The church, which should have been a sanctuary, often weaponized mortality itself. By painting life on earth as a mere testing ground, a valley of tears to be endured, they justified the horrific conditions of the present. Why improve the sewers or feed the hungry when the reward lies only in death? The fear of hell was more potent than the fear of the sword, keeping the masses compliant even as they rotted in the mud. Thomas's defiant walk into the grave was a microscopic rebellion against this crushing weight. In a world that stripped men of agency from the moment they were born until the moment they died, choosing how to enter the dark was a monumental act. But as the sun sets on this era, and the soil settles over the millions of anonymous bones beneath the cities of Europe, we are left with a haunting realization. The modern world was built on top of this graveyard. Our concepts of medicine, of rights, of sanitation, and of liberty were born as frantic reactions to this age of darkness. We learned the value of life only after seeing how cheaply it could be spent. The silence over the mass grave is heavy, but it is not empty. It echoes with the lesson of the medieval experience that civilization is a thin veneer over a chaotic reality, and that the dignity of the individual is a hard-won prize, not a guarantee. Thomas is gone. The plague eventually burned itself out. The feudal lords lost their grip, and the iron instruments of torture rusted into museum pieces. But let us never forget the fragility of those who came before. They walked through the fire so that we might sit in the light. Their suffering was the mortar in the foundation of history, a grim reminder that for most of human existence, life was nasty, brutish, and incredibly short. The story of the medieval era is not one of knights and glory. It is the story of the endurance of the human spirit against impossible odds, ending, as all things do, in the quiet earth.